This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we're going to walk through the steps required to bring up our Oracle XE and our SQL Server Developer Edition databases in Docker containers using Docker Compose, and then we're going to attempt to establish connections to those databases within our Docker container. In order to create our containers, we're going to need to have access to the Docker Compose file. And I have created a Docker Compose file that we can use that is stored in a GitHub repository. And I will provide the link to the GitHub repository that you can clone from within the installation assignment. And I will also provide the contents of what's in the GitHub repository as a zip file. So you can choose either way, either to clone the repository or to pull down and extract the zip file with the contents. And I think I'll even put the link to the GitHub repository on the YouTube video description as well, in case you want to refer back to it after the class has ended. Now, in this case, our GitHub repository has the Docker Compose file. Notice that it has a .yml, a YAML file extension. That is significant for a Docker Compose file. It has to have a YML file extension in order to run a Docker Compose file. It also has specified a .env, an environment file that contains passwords and directory locations, etc. Typically, we would secure our env file and we would not post it to a GitHub repository, but this is just for training purposes, and this would not be production worthy. We would never put this into production with a published env file. That would be locked down. But for our intents purposes for this class, it's totally fine. Now I'm going to switch over to the file location that has the Docker Compose file so that we can talk through what is in that Docker Compose file. You can look at the Docker Compose file using any text editor. I am using Visual Studio Code. If you are using Visual Studio Code to create Docker Compose files, you can actually run Docker Compose files with the terminal window as well. So it's a very nice environment to create these types of files. Now, when I look at my Docker Compose file, the very first thing that we see is we have a services keyword. That service is going to indicate what services are going to be defined within my Docker Compose file. And we see here that we have two services, an Oracle and a SQL Server. I'm going to talk first about the Oracle, and then we'll look at the SQL Server. Some of the things will be similar between the two, but there are going to be some differences as well. In the first case, I have a container name that I am explicitly defining as Oracle_DB. This is not a requirement that this key is there. I could omit it and it would generate a default container name. I have an image specified. This image is what it's going to pull down in order to create the container. Now, in a lot of cases, we get our images from Docker Hub. In this case, Oracle has their own container registry, and we are pulling the image from their registry. If we look, and let me drill into it, you'll see that there's an express. This is the image that we're actually pulling down. And it also gives like a command line configuration if we were just going to run the command from the command line and what that might look like. So there's a lot of stuff here that we would have to enter at the command line that a Docker Compose file, we can set it up and not have to have such a long line that would be error prone to enter. Now, when I come back to my Docker Compose file, the next thing that I see is a deploy. Now, a Docker Compose file does not need to have the deploy attribute with any of the resource limitations, but if we do not constrain our containers, if they think that they need some more resources, they're just going to go out and grab it and keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. So in our case, we're going to try to limit the CPU usage to 0.5 and the memory to 2 gig. Now we can always at a later time come back take a look to see how our container is actually processing by looking at the stats. And if we see that essentially the container needs to be bumped up, then we can bring down our container and then recreate it by changing either the CPUs or the memories or both if necessary. We notice next that we have ports, and we have two different numbers. We have outside of the container number and an inside the container number. In our case, Oracle is going to run on ports 1521 and 5500 inside the container, and because I have SQL Server and Oracle running outside of the container locally on my computer as well as from within the containers, I need to specify some other number than 1521 and 5500, otherwise I would have conflicts. Now, if you want to keep them at 1521 and 5500 outside of the container, that's fine. You'll just have to make modifications as we go through and define connections. That'll be up to you to keep that the same. If you want to be pretty much in line with me as far as what the port numbers are, then you should have no changes that you have to make on the fly. The next thing that we state is the volumes. If we decide that we want to keep our volumes around, so if we would happen to do a Docker compose down and our container goes away, we would still have our volume defined, which means that the next time that we bring up our container, if we had a sample database already defined, we would have access to that same data. We wouldn't have to go through the process of recreating it. So that's one of the things with the volume. Now you'll notice that this is indicated as Aura data. And if we go down to the bottom, notice that we have volumes specified, and Aura data is one of those volumes. Next, we have environment. So there are environment variables that we need to set for Oracle. One is the password, and this is going to be the password that we would set for logging in as the sys account using the sysdba role. And if we switch over to our env file, notice Oracle_pwd, we have Oracle_pwd. So whatever we define within our curly braces as our variable, it needs to be defined here the very same way with an equal sign and then the value that's associated. So we're setting up our password as admin for that account. We are also setting our character set to the AL32UTF-8 for Oracle. Next, we have SQL Server. This time, for SQL Server, we're getting our image from Docker Hub. Now, if I look at Docker Hub, let me go back here. I would come into hub.docker.com. I can search for my image, which is MS SQL, looking for the verified publisher. If I scroll down a little ways, I can see my image. If I drill into the image, it's going to give me image information about that image, and notice that it has a pretty long command line that I could copy and try to run it. Notice that it has a PID of evaluation. That's one of the ones that will have this parameter specified, but we won't be using evaluation. There's a couple of different options for that. One is also enterprise version as well. So there's lots of different versions for that. Notice here that this is the MS SQL SA password. So this is the SA password account that we have specified. And we also have a parameter of accept EULA that we have to provide. And then here's our PID values with Developer Express standard. We're going to be specifying developer here. If we come back, we again have our resources constrained to the same amounts. This is going to be running inside the container on port 1433. Outside the container, it's going to be running on 15433 based on what this configuration is currently set up. If you wanted to change that to 1433 and you do not have SQL Server locally installed, then that should be fine. Here's our accept EULA parameter. It's going to have a value of Y. We have our MS SQL PID, which is developer. We looked at that list. We also have our MS SQL dir, data dir, log dir, backup, dir, and then our SA password. Now our SA password has to be a little bit more complex than our Oracle. That's why it's got uppercase, lowercase, symbols, and numbers. And it has to be of a certain length. That's why that's set up that way. If you want to change that password, you're more than capable of doing that. We're just going to keep it there for this class. So in this case, we have all of our parameters here. Now notice we have some that are being reused down here in the volumes for our environment parameters. So another reason why we would want to go ahead and set them up as environment instead of hard coding the values here, because we would have multiple places that we would potentially have to change a value. So this is essentially the walkthrough for our Docker Compose file. The next thing we want to do is bring up PowerShell. And we want to run this as administrator. So I'm right clicking and run as administrator. It's going to bring up the user account control indicating that it's Windows PowerShell and the verified publisher is Microsoft Windows. If I say yes, then it's going to bring up the PowerShell window. I need to first navigate to the directory where my YAML file is. So I need to go ahead and do a CD, and then I believe I have my path copied. So I can just drill into that directory. I should be able to do dir and locate that YAML file. As long as I see the YAML file, I should be able to go ahead and run the Docker Compose command. The command is essentially Docker Compose up, because I want to bring up the containers, and I want to specify a -d parameter, which means that essentially it's going to run the actual command and return control back to this window. It's not going to tie up this PowerShell window. If we would go ahead and run it without the -d, it's going to bring the container up. But then when we would close down or do a Control-C or something within the PowerShell window, it's going to bring the container down. So let's go ahead and use the -d. We can see that it's going to be pulling our images here. Usually it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to pull the images. And then after it completes pulling the images, then it would go through the process of bringing the containers up. I'll go ahead and speed up this part of the video when I edit the video. All right, now we can see that the containers have been created, also the volumes. If we go back to our Docker desktop, if I start with my images, we can see that we have our Microsoft SQL Server and we have our Oracle image that have been pulled. If we look at our volumes, we have the directory where we have our Docker Compose file _ and then the volume name. If we go back to our Docker Compose file, we have our volume names down here that have been appended with the folder name for the Docker Compose file where it's located at. If we go into our env file, we'll notice that we have file locations specified within the container that those volumes are associated with. So we could actually go into our container and drill into those directories and understand that there is that relationship there. Now, if I go back to Docker Desktop, I can look at my containers as well. If I was not seeing anything, I can always click on the arrow and show the actual containers below. We have our SQL Server _DB. That was one of the containers that we named. And we have Oracle _DB. That was the other one. Let's start with the Oracle. I'm going to go ahead and click on these dots using a left mouse click and open it in Terminal. This is going to take me into the terminal for the Oracle database, and I can execute a command to connect to the database using the SQL Plus utility, connecting as the sys account as the role sysdba. Once I do that, it's going to ask me for a password. I can go back to my Docker Compose env file, and look at the Oracle password, which is admin, and go ahead and go back and type that in. Once I do that, I can see that I am connected to the database, and that's really all I want to do at this point. I don't have any schema to actually select any data of real significance yet, so I'm just going to exit out of the container and then go ahead and clear it. We want to go ahead and click on the arrow and go back, and this time we want to drill into the SQL Server. If I click on the three dots with a left mouse click, open in terminal, I can go ahead and do an ls-l. I need to locate where my SQL command is. I need to provide the full path in order to execute the command. If I change to the opt folder and do an ls-l, I can see that I have my MS SQL tools 18. That's the directory that it's located in. So if I drill into that, do an ls-l and go into the bin directory, do an ls-l, I have my SQL command. So now I have the whole entire path, the msql-tools 18/bin/SQL command. I can type that out. SQL 18/bin SQL command with a U of SA, and then I want to add a no here on the command line. It's going to prompt me for the password. If I go back to my Docker Compose file, the password that I need is this testing at 112233. It requires a more complex password, so I need to be able to enter that at the command line. So if I go back to Docker, I'm going to go ahead and enter this. And now I am into my session, and I can go ahead and do a select of the database version using select space @ version. In order to execute that command, I need to execute a go, and then it's going to go out and execute that command, return the version of the database. And at least at this point, we know that the database is functioning enough to bring back our version information. So we're just going to get out of our container and clear the screen at this point. So we've gone through, we've kind of talked about how to connect to the databases from within the actual containers. Now, that's not typically ideal for doing any real data analysis. In a lot of cases, we would rather use some type of a development IDE tool in order to connect to the databases, and we'll be looking at connecting to Oracle using SQL Developer in a future video, and then connecting to our SQL Server database using SQL Server Management Studio and Data Azure. Data Azure is the version that is portable between Windows and Mac OS, and SQL Server Management Studio has a few more capabilities in it, but it is only Windows compatible. It will not run on Mac OS. So let's go back to our containers and let's take a look at how we can deal with them on a day-to-day basis. When we're done working on our assignments, we want to make sure that we stop our containers or we remove our containers, one of the two. And the first way that we can do that is simply by clicking on the stop button at the highest level. That's going to shut down all of the containers underneath the Docker DB Windows setup. Now that they're done, I can safely close down my Docker desktop. If I did that, though, I would still have something running in my taskbar that I would need to come in and do a right click. So we can see Moby in the taskbar here, and we would need to right click and close that as well in order to make sure that all of the components of Docker are closed down. So that's one way. Then the next time that I would open it up, my containers would be stopped. I would come in, and if I needed to, I could restart them both, or I could restart one or the other. I'm going to go ahead and start them all up. The second option that we can do is, I think I shut down my PowerShell window. So let's go ahead and relaunch PowerShell as administrator and say yes to the user account control. And now I'm back into PowerShell. I need to go back into my directory. Let's go ahead and paste and drill into that directory. And if I do a dir, I am where my Docker Compose file is. Now I can go ahead and do a Docker Compose down because I want to bring the containers down as opposed to up. Once I do that, it's going to stop and remove my containers. This is safe to do. Now if we go back to Docker Desktop, my containers are gone. My images are still there. So the next time that I would try to recreate my image, it's not going to pull from the Oracle registry or Docker Hub because the images are local. I also have my volumes, so if I created any sample databases, they would be safe and all of the data would be stored there, so I could come back into PowerShell the next day and I could go ahead and do a Docker Compose up-d. So that's an option as well. Now, taking the container down and bringing it back up, if there was some type of reason that I needed to tweak one of the CPU settings or the memory settings, I could go back into my Docker Compose file, make that modification, and then if I brought my container down, saved my configuration, brought my container back up, then it should apply that setting that has been changed. I can always check my statistics of my Docker containers using the Docker stats. This is going to show me what's running, and we can see that nothing is up to the 1.927 gigabyte limit for memory purposes. If we re-execute this command, the CPU still is pretty low and our limits are nowhere near. So we're pretty safe at this point. But as the course proceeds, there may be a time where you need to revisit what the stats are of your container and potentially tweak those settings. And now you know the way that you would go about doing that. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.